Good evening, Eagle's Nest. Welcome to Digging Deeper moment number 14. We've been in the Sermon on the Mount, and we've seen that Jesus' Sermon on the Mount has three primary sections. We are coming to the end of the first section, which is called his Midrash, and we've been studying from Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 through 48. Jesus tells us in Matthew 5, 17 through 20 that he tells his disciples that he did not come to do what other rabbis had been doing in his time, and that is give people a loophole out of following the commandments in the Old Testament by listing them from least to the greatest. He came to interpret and to apply the Old Testament in the correct way so that we can apply it to our lives in a practical way. And here's why. Breaking the least commandments leads to breaking greater commandments, he tells us, which leads to greater and greater consequences in our lives. So he's not trying in the Sermon on the Mount to give us a loophole, which he might have been accused of in his day, of lowering the standard. He says he's not here to do that, nor is he here to make this legalistic. What Jesus is trying to do here, and does well, is apply the Old Testament to our lives in a very practical way. And so Matthew 5, 21 through 28, we saw last week that Jesus starts talking about the subject of anger. He's got 5 examples here in Matthew 21 through 48 of how to apply the Old Testament to our lives. And we'll get back to that in the next couple of weeks. But for today we saw last week that Jesus was telling us how to get off the escalator of sin. And we saw that the first escalator was the escalator of anger. So there's 5 examples or 5 escalators that Jesus talks about to illustrate his teachings and understanding of the Old Testament. The first is anger, and we looked at that one last week. And everyone knows that when we get angry, it tends to escalate. Anger escalates. We know that. The second one is the escalator of lust, and everyone knows that lust is never satisfied. The third one is the escalator of lying, and everyone knows that one lie leads to another. The fourth one is the escalator of vengeance, and everyone knows that vengeance is never enough. It always needs to be a little bit more. And the final one is the escalator of hate. And everyone knows that hate leads to more hate. And so before we go any further in these examples of how to get off the escalator or to get off these escalators and any other escalator in the Bible, we need to stop here and consider how we approach the Sermon on the Mount. Because how we approach the Sermon on the Mount will determine whether or not we are able to get off these escalators. How we approach the Sermon on the Mount determines whether or not this sermon becomes a road to happiness or a road to misery. Let me illustrate this by reading a portion of the book I'm currently writing on the Sermon on the Mount. As of right now, I'm calling it The Road to Happiness. I have a long way to go before I'm done, and I'll be adding material in the book that I'm not adding in these digging deeper moments. So I ask you to pray for me so I can get this done, because it takes a lot of work to do this on top of my normal schedule. But here's a chapter. I've titled the chapter, I haven't numbered the chapter yet, but here's a chapter that kind of explains what I'm talking about when it comes to how we approach or how we see the Sermon on the Mount. And I entitled this chapter, Jesus' Lens of Grace. Jesus spoke the Sermon on the Mount and looked at the Old Testament through the eyes of grace, not legalism. And so let me read it for you. I write, in The Wizard of Oz, 2 characters stand in direct contrast to one another. The first is the wizard, who is a powerless and self-made man who sought to convince others that he was something he was not. In the end, when his impotence was exposed by Dorothy's dog, she exclaimed to him, "You are a very bad man." To which he responded, "Oh no, my dear, I am a very good man. I'm just a bad wizard, or a very bad wizard." The other was Glinda, the unassuming witch of the north. She had no need to prove anything about herself, for she had a power that the wizard did not possess. Her actions spoke louder than her words. It was Glinda who first welcomed Dorothy to Munchkinland. It was Glinda who saved her from the poppy fields, and it was Glinda who actually gave Dorothy a way back home. These 2 characters illustrate for us the different ways that we can read the Sermon on the Mount. We can read it like the wizard, reading it as something that we have to achieve or to live out through our own human effort and strength, or ingenuity. Or we can read it like Glinda through the eyes of grace, understanding that we cannot live up to the standards found in the Sermon on the Mount in our own power. In his book, The Jesus I Never Knew, Philip Yancey illustrates the difference between these 2 approaches by looking at the lives of 2 19th century Russian novelists, Leo Tolstoy and Fyodor Dostoevsky. According to Yancey, Tolstoy read the Sermon on the Mount like the wizard. Therefore, it became a road of misery to him. All he could see in the Sermon on the Mount is the perfect ideal, what God demanded. So like the rabbi in Jesus' day, he kept devising and creating new lists of rules that would help him to live it out. This made his life and the life of those around him miserable. Listen to the words of his wife. And remember, he was a religious man trying to live out the Sermon on the Mount. She says, "There is so little genuine warmth about him. His kindness does not come from his heart, but merely from his principles. His biographies will tell of how he helped the laborers to carry buckets of water, but no one will ever know that he never gave his wife a rest and never, in all these 32 years, gave his child a drink of water or spent 5 minutes beside his bedside to give me a chance to rest a little bit from all of my labors." Dostoevsky, on the other hand, read the Sermon on the Mount through the eyes of grace, Yancey says. And he writes, where Tolstoy worked out aesthetic schemes for self-improvement, Dostoevsky periodically squandered his health and his fortune with alcohol and gambling. Dostoevsky got many things wrong in life, but he got one thing right. His novels communicate grace and forgiveness with a Tolstoyan force. The proper way, let me add here, this is me speaking again, the proper way to read the Sermon on the Mount is illustrated by Jesus himself. Whereas the rabbi could only see God's demands, like Tolstoy in the Old Testament, remember, Jesus' Midrash is an explanation of the Old Testament. Jesus saw God's grace. He looked at the Old Testament through God's grace. An example of this can be seen by what Jesus and the rabbi and how they differed on their view of the Sabbath. The rabbi viewed the Sabbath as a demand that God puts upon us. Jesus saw it as a gift from God. That's why he says the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath in Mark chapter 2, verse 27. Ultimately, it is the way that Jesus saw and lived out the Old Testament that led the rabbi, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees to plot against him. Just as trying to be a wizard on his own strength caused the wizard to be a very bad man, trying to live out the Old Testament on their own strength, making lists and rules and regulations of what you had to do on the Sabbath, what you couldn't do on the Sabbath. And all these rules actually turned the rabbi and many others into very bad men. So if we want to be very good men, and we want to apply this Sermon on the Mount in our lives, and we want it to be a road to happiness and a road to misery, we're going to have to read the Sermon on the Mount through the eyes of grace like Jesus. Doing so makes the road to happiness, the Sermon on the Mount, a road to happiness. Not doing so makes it the road to misery. If after reading the Sermon on the Mount, we try to get off these 5 escalators that Jesus illustrates the Old Testament on our own strength, we're going to end up like Leo Tolstoy and the wizard. Very bad men and very bad women. This sermon, the greatest sermon of all, will turn into a road of misery. And that's not Jesus' intent at all. Jesus' intent here in the Sermon on the Mount is not to heap up guilt upon us, to keep showing us where we missed the mark so we feel bad about ourselves. What Jesus is showing us here in this sermon is similar to what the Apostle Paul does in Romans 7 and 8, which we'll deal with next week, because we need to deal with this before we go any further in this sermon. But Jesus' intent is to let us know, as he lays out the requirements of the Old Testament and he shows us how to apply the Old Testament in our lives, one of the main points he's making is that we need to enter the kingdom of heaven in order to be able to live like this. We can't live up to the standards in this sermon. We can't get off these escalators in our own strength. We need to enter the kingdom of heaven, or better put, the kingdom of heaven needs to enter us. 8 times in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus mentions the kingdom of heaven. In chapter 5, verse 3, and verse 10, verse 19, and verse 20, in chapter 6, verse 10, verse 13, and verse 33, and in chapter 7, verse 21. His main point is that we need to enter the kingdom of heaven, and we've already covered how we do that in the Beatitudes. Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Right out of the gate, before we even read or hear the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is already giving us a hint. If we approach the Sermon on the Mount as something like the wizard, we have to figure out how to live this out in our own strength and ingenuity, we're going to end up very bad people. We're going to end up on the road to misery. We won't be able to get off these escalators of sin, the ones mentioned here or the other ones mentioned in Scripture. And so let me encourage you as we go on in the Sermon on the Mount, not to approach the Sermon on the Mount like Tolstoy or the Wizard, but to approach it like Glinda, and better put, to approach it like Jesus with the eyes of grace. Jesus didn't give us this sermon so that we would work harder to try to live up to it. Jesus spoke this sermon to get us to see that we need God's help. We need his kingdom power in us in order to get off the escalator of sin. We need the grace of God. The grace of God is best described and defined in Philippians 2, chapter 2, verse 13, when Paul writes, "For it is God who works in you, both to will and to do of his good pleasure." God works in us to want to live up to this standard, and God works in us to be able to live up to the standard and get off the escalator. Reading the Sermon on the Mount through the eyes of grace will transform it from a road of misery into a road of happiness. As I said earlier, the Apostle Paul addresses the same issue in the book of Romans. He just says it in different language, and we'll pick up there next week when we get back into Jesus' Midrash. Have a great week, and we'll see you.